you looking for healthier, fuller hair? Do you want extra money for bills, trips, extracurricular activities for your kids, or do you want to replace your entire income? Monat is the answer. Our products are Leaping Bunny certified, vegan, and Monat can be used by anyone, including your kids and pets. Message me on my Instagram to partner with me. Founder shares are available, and as a market partner, you have access to uncapped bonuses, 45% commission, 35 to 55% off discounts, on top of all-inclusive paid trips. Right now, I also have a free gift for anyone that partners with me, so don't miss out. You can message me on my Instagram at LizChilvers87.
We still do 7 NUFC Matters show a week for free. But if you want to help support NUFC Matters, then there are a few ways of doing it. Hit the like button on each live broadcast and video. This helps the channel grow. Hit the subscribe button and select the all notifications bell so you don't miss a single show. If you want to help us financially, then you can join the channel using this button with the membership starting at $1.99 a month. Or you can drop us a donation in the chat using a super sticker. We're also looking for sponsors. If you'd like your brand advertised on the flyers for the show and featured during the ad break, then email John at nufcmatters.com to arrange today.
Talking to myself again, but it's the only way you're ever gonna learn. You look back and it's all in the past. I'm dwelling on the thoughts I cannot say to you. If I don't say the words, then maybe it's not true. And it feels alright when they come and say to you,
good evening, welcome to NUFC Matters with me, Steve Wraith. It is the transfer show with Ben Jacobs. Good evening, Ben.
Good evening, how you doing?
Very good, mate. Good to see you. And we've got to start. We like a bit of humour on here. Stephen Kennedy says, can't believe it. I got a Ben Jacobs jumper at the weekend as a gift. And my daughter was watching an older podcast a few weeks ago, and I jokingly said, now, that's a jumper. She thought I wanted one. So there you go, Ben. You're a trend guru now as well.
Why didn't you want the jumper? That's what I want to know. We need to see a picture first of all so I can fully assess. And
get it
is it
sent
this
in.
Zara type one with multiple colours where you look a bit like a rhubarb custard, or is it just one of my more understated ones like this sort of silvery grey one that we have on this evening? But picture, please.
Fantastic. Yeah, send it in, Stephen. I'm sure you will. And I'll show it to Ben next time he's on next week, hopefully. Big well done to Ben as well last week. Huge figures for the show. We got 4,600 watching live last week, which has never been known on this channel for a transfer show or for any show. So brilliant stuff. And 1,000 already tuned in tonight for the Q&A with Ben that people enjoy, because Ben does try to give us a little bit of common sense, I guess, and an unbiased view. As a Leicester City fan, Newcastle is close to his heart in second place, but he can give us a few inside, tips and stuff that he feels, may or may not be going on at St James's Park. And just want to get your opinion, basically, on what happened over the weekend, Ben, because it was quite a crazy weekend on the Newcastle United timeline on X for starters. But lots of ins, lots of outs, on and off the pitch.
Yeah, I mean, PSR loom large, unfortunately, for Newcastle, but they were able to allay any concerns. So all is well now, and it's a new financial year. That's the good news. It was interesting because we've probably done 3 or 4 shows together where I've said 30 to 50 million was the ballpark that I was always told. And that was factoring in. Now I'm told retrospectively a bit of new information, getting a higher number of Dan Ashworth compensation in. But the actual figure that they negotiated, I'm told, is under 7 million. And of course, for many, many weeks, we've heard this ambitious, but no doubt in Newcastle's mind, fair, contractually speaking anyway, number of 20 million. So that left them scrambling, and it's no coincidence that the Ashworth deal got done just before the deadline. I think the impasse is a mixture of Newcastle advancing on their own sporting director target, but the fact that they needed that extra bit of money. So when the accounts come out, we'll be able to do the exact maths, but it looks like the number that they actually needed was somewhere just north of 50 million. And we shouldn't add up the transfers of Minter and Anderson and say that's the exact number, because they might want a bit of leeway, they might want to move in the market. And let's not forget, you have got the Ashworth money as well. But it just shows you that when I've reported that number, 30 to 50 million, even 30 triggered the fan base. And I was told for weeks and weeks and weeks, it's never going to be that amount. There's no financial mismanagement. We can spend. The deadline's not that big an issue. Well, it was, unfortunately. And of course, I don't mean that with any joy or gloating. I'm just pointing out that Newcastle's main priority was to balance the books. And luckily, they've been able to do that. So now we herald in a new financial year, and hopefully they can move more positively. I think that they will be glad that they've got to this juncture with Anthony Gordon, Bruno Guimaraes, and Alexander Isak all still at the club. Regarding Isak, the idea that Chelsea came calling and tried to trade Nicholas Jackson is downplayed by sources I speak to, and in fact, emphatically denied, not just distanced, but shut down. But there was a conversation, and ultimately you make that call because you want to test Newcastle's resolve. And suitors that I spoke to all had different opinions. Some thought Newcastle would need to make 30, some thought they might need 100. So of course you make that call, but nothing advanced with Alexander Isak. It was a little bit different with Anthony Gordon. There was a period of maybe 12 hours where it looked like if Liverpool wanted him, they could at least move. And in the end, Newcastle were able to get their business in other directions, and Newcastle didn't really want to lose Gordon, and Liverpool didn't like the cash opportunity with or without a player. Because ultimately, the Newcastle valuation of Anthony Gordon is somewhere close to 100 million. So that was always going to be difficult to get done. It is true that Gordon would have been open to that move, but he's just going to have to put it behind him, come back from the Euros and focus on Newcastle United, because Newcastle are relatively confident now that he'll stay at the club. And then there was no real play, to my knowledge, for Bruno Guimaraes, probably because the release clause expired just before the financial deadline. So if someone was going to make an inquiry there, I think they would have done that around the time the clause lapsed, rather than try again just a few days or weeks afterwards. But I still think there might be a possibility there where Manchester City could try their luck around the 80 million mark. Newcastle are in a much stronger position, though, now as things stand. And then with the incomings, the priority positions haven't been addressed yet. I think that's partially down to the fact that they were waiting for a new financial year. But Lewis Hall was confirmed, 28 million total package, but the add-ons could take that to 35 million. My understanding, as I've said consistently, is that Newcastle will put that money on the 2024-2025 books. So that won't be a negative in order to try and comply with PSR for the financial year ending 2023-2024. Couple of goalkeepers came in. Maybe the fact that 2 were added, bit of a surprise. John Ruddy, by the way, is a fantastic character, so I expect him to be a really positive signing for Newcastle in training and in the dressing room. It remains to be seen, of course, whether he gets any significant minutes, if at all, because of his age. But you want a character like that that can also be a goalkeeper and a coach and a mentor and a dressing room influence as well. So all of that is very positive from Newcastle's perspective. And now they've got their main business, where I think they'll want a centre-back, a right winger potentially, especially if Miguel Almiron departs, maybe another striker if Callum Wilson goes, with the expectation that Isak will stay. And then still potentially a chance to strengthen in midfield as well, because Elliot Anderson's departed. You can't say categorically an offer won't come in for Guimaraes, even if Newcastle can now just bat it away. But they've got some work to do. They've balanced their books. They've got a few out. And now they've got the rest of the window to try and strengthen so they can make a push for European football.
Interesting stuff. Interesting weekend. Lots of people got lots of opinions, and lots of people have got lots of questions. 1,800 watching. If you're watching on Twitter or LinkedIn, please get onto YouTube, search NUFC Matters, hit the subscription button. It's free. We do 7 shows a week. Okay, James Wilson asked a simple question on X. He said, Ben, do you think Newcastle's record transfer fee will be broken this window?
I'm not so sure. I stand by what I said before, which is that I don't see Newcastle spending more than 50 million, and we should clarify this. And I've been meaning to do this for a while, because whenever people speak about spending, you have to understand that clubs, journalists always talk in net spend. So ultimately, if you bring in 50 million and you spend 50 million, you're spending 100 million. And that's where I think we're often confused. And the number you spend is irrelevant. What's important is the net spend and how you budget for that. Do you want to make a profit? Are you prepared to make a loss? How big a loss are you prepared to make? So if you look at Newcastle's books approximately now, and apologies if I've missed any academy outgoings, you can basically say ballpark, they have brought in 70, 75 million. And therefore, if they want to spend 75 million plus 50, then that might be their window. But I don't see their net spend exceeding 50 million. So if you're going to break your club record, you're probably only going to bring in 2 players. And I think Newcastle are much more likely to divide their budget on 4. A right winger, and we knew that they were in the mix for Elise. So there's obviously an appetite to spend 50, 60 million on the right player. I think any striker they bring in will be supportive to Alexander Isak, and on the premise that Wilson goes. So that won't be a massive amount of money. And then defenders in the market at the moment are really interesting, aren't they? Because they're all going for between 30 and 60 million top defenders. Max Kilman's valued at 45 million. We can classify him as a Wolves target. You've got Jean-Claire Todibo. West Ham are the newest suitor there. Manchester United can't sign him because UEFA rules stop them doing business, because both Nice and Manchester United are in the Europa League together. And you have others like Lenny Yoro, somewhere around the 40 or 50 million mark too. Matthias de Ligt, who Manchester United are in formal talks for, he could be available for 35 million or so, plus bonuses. So that's the ballpark that you need. But none of them quite break the transfer record. So I don't see Newcastle going that far. And it's not only for financial reasons, because maybe they could just sign less players and spend more money on one of them. There's just no target out there that I'm aware of on the Newcastle radar that quite at this stage tops the club record.
Okay, 1862 on X says, has Ben heard any rumours regarding the Man City arbitration case? And does he think that there will be another challenge on PSR rules from Premier League clubs, as it has been admitted that there is anti-competitive by Ratcliffe?
Well, I think Jim Ratcliffe's comments are just one opinion, right? So the starting point the Premier League have got is that the majority of clubs voted for these rules. So if you're to level anti-competition, then you're going against the majority. And because it got put to a vote, it's very difficult to actually change anything via the Premier League system, which is why concurrent to Manchester City and their 115 charges, you have a challenge of the fair market valuation and the third-party transaction aspects of the Premier League rules. And what Manchester City are arguing is, with fair market valuation, why should that be done by anyone connected to the Premier League, even if they have a layer of independence? And what they're arguing with anti-competition is you don't need fair market valuation if you allow third parties to do business together. And why not? Because it benefits the clubs, and ultimately value is set by demand. And if somebody wants to pay something and somebody wants to take something, then in most walks of life, you've got a deal, whether it's overinflated or not. So what Manchester City can do is they can go to the Court of Arbitration potentially, and that would relate to challenging any punishments, which they did with UEFA, and they were successful in that. Then they can wait for their ruling from the independent panel at the Premier League, but they don't have the same recourse to go back to the Court of Arbitration, although there is an appeals process. So instead of that, they're challenging first to try and set a new precedent and say, hang on a minute, the Premier League can vote whatever they like, but if it's contradictory with wider anti-competition rules, then that trumps what the league think, and then we'll be in a stronger position to potentially counter with some of the charges relating to the 115, which might mean that they win on some of those charges or all of those charges rather than lose. Then simplifying the 115 aspect, that's being heard by an independent panel. And if you think how long it took Everton and Nottingham Forest, and those were relatively simple charges, it's no real surprise that this is dragging on. And Manchester City have also got a very famous lawyer in Lord Panic, who does anything but panic and will delay and will challenge and will drag this on as long as possible. So what we will get, we think in autumn, is a first ruling that will have consequences. And potentially, if Manchester City are found guilty, although let's stress, to be balanced, they say they're innocent, but a points deduction could come. And the most interesting thing for me is knowing if Man City have any guilt, there'll be a knock-on effect, there'll be an appeal. But as we saw with Nottingham Forest and Everton, when the first punishment is issued by the independent panel, it's an immediate punishment. And only if you win the appeal is it then taken away. And I think that gives the Premier League an upper hand in all of this, because Manchester City can't afford to lose and then delay it for 2 years in an appeal, because the punishment will live on immediately. And therefore, if they get to the end of next season and they're still arguing it in court, the punishment will be there. And obviously, if that is ratioed to the same scale as a points deduction as Everton and Forest, and they were to be found guilty, it's going to be an astronomical points deduction. And if they were to be stripped of titles, or if they were to be expelled, then it will be fascinating to see how that's dealt with. Because with the points deduction, it's supposed to be instant, but it's so complicated. Can you do that? And obviously, if you expel them with an appeal, it would grind the league to a halt. Do you have to remove them instantly? Do you have to take away points of people that have potentially got points off Man City? It's a very dicey and difficult legal grey area. And this is why I think that it's taking so long, because they need to know what they can do if they are to be found guilty, and it is still an if, and they need to know what the follow-on legal consequences are. And I think this case genuinely could drag on between 2 and 5 years, certainly if it relates to expulsions and stripped titles, because you can't kick them out mid-season and then they appeal, and then what? They get reinstated and the whole league's a mess. So it's going to be a really challenging situation. And the lawyers that I speak to have always said to me that maybe it would have been more beneficial for the Premier League not to pick 115 charges, but to focus more on 6 or 7 that they were really confident in, and then try and get some form of guilt through, obviously, the independent panel, who are not siding with the Premier League or Manchester City. They're just there to assess. Because you're dealing with 115, there's so many counters, there's so much back and forth, there's so much legal red tape, that there is a danger that it just gets buried and buried and buried and buried. So I still think we'll get a bit more clarity in the autumn, but I don't think that we'll learn a particularly final or full resolution for anything between 2 and 5 years.
2,500 people tuned in. If you're watching on LinkedIn or X, then please get yourself onto YouTube, search nufc matters, hit the subscribe button. Last question that we got on X was from Northeast Steve. He says, do we need 4 keepers, Ben? Does the club need to be held to account for the PSR debacle when they knew the rules? And with the 2 keepers signed, does that rule out Trafford or Mamardashvili? What are the chances as well of Wilson, Trippier and Almiron going before the window shuts?
Yeah, I think with Mamardashvili, he's had an excellent Euros. And my feeling is still, if Jan Oblak leaves Atletico Madrid, they'll come in for him. But Newcastle are there. The difference is that his price tag is around 30, 35 million. And Trafford's only 20 million at a maximum, albeit you've got to find a structure with Burnley. So they're still looking at Trafford. There's been no breakthrough at the time we're recording this. And I wouldn't view too much on the goalkeeper front as an indication they're not going to get another one in. And the only reason I say that is because you have a situation where Dubravka could go, and that will free up one spot. And then with Ruddy, as I said earlier, wonderful character, but not joining to really be competing for first team football week in, week out. It's funny, actually, because John Ruddy was the young goalkeeper at Rushden and Diamonds when I first started as a football commentator, and he had a big reputation. And in that dressing room, even then when he was very young, he was an absolutely wonderful individual. So I think the Newcastle squad will really welcome him around, and it wouldn't surprise me if he's half goalkeeper, half coach in terms of the day-to-day role that he plays. And that's what you want, you know, the kind of player that can come in and be happy to be a squad player, there for the ride, there for the celebratory photos, but barely putting his shorts on and getting out on the field, at least as far as Premier League football is concerned. So yeah, they still could move for another goalkeeper. With Callum Wilson, there still could be something to watch with Saudi Arabia, and West Ham United are another club to watch. I think Wolves are still looking for a striker as well, even though Larson has come in today. That one's been announced, but if they can do something at value, they might add another one. And then there'll be a domino effect. You've got clubs like Everton and Crystal Palace who are looking predominantly for one name, whether that's Amanda Broya or Eddie Nketiah. And Wilson, despite his injury record and age, might be available a little bit cheaper. With Miguel Almiron, there is interest from Saudi Arabia. The excellent story that Keith Downey ran was not only about the reality, but potentially about setting off other Saudi clubs, because Al-Shabaab have looked in the past, Al-Qadsiya have considered Almiron, and we know that the PIF clubs obviously can do a deal with Newcastle United because it's kind of the same people as part of the negotiations. So I think the beauty of having that out there is if any Saudi clubs are interested, they're all going to come out the woodwork now. My expectation is that Newcastle will entertain an offer for Miguel Almiron for somewhere in the region of 20 million, maybe 25 million with add-ons. And it remains to be seen yet whether Almiron's prepared to go to Saudi Arabia. But the reality is that Newcastle are looking to strengthen on that right-hand side, and they're open to offers for Almiron.
Interesting stuff. Obviously, Miggy didn't go to Saudi in January. Let's see whether he does go now. Okay, we're into the questions that you lot have put in the chat. I'll try to get through as many as possible. Tom Dixon said, Ben, do you think Newcastle will go for Elanga? Of course, the Forest winger who did quite well at St James's Park when Chris Wood got a hat-trick.
Yeah, he did. And I think that Elanga is going to be in demand. He's only 22 years of age. And at the moment, I think it's fair to say that Newcastle are one of the front runners. We know that they've opened talks with Nottingham Forest for a deal. But the challenge is that there was an earlier period before PSR where they were leveraging Elliot Anderson and Forest were having none of it. So now they'd have to come back and you've not got any leverage. It's unlikely that a player would go the other way. And we're past the PSR deadline anyway. So Newcastle may not be looking at losing somebody to get somebody. So the Forest position remains that they want to hold on to Elanga, and only a very big offer is going to change that. And once again, Nottingham Forest were cutting this PSR deadline relatively fine as well. We know that last season they had a points deduction, but that's passed. So they're in a stronger position. And if they really needed to sell, they probably would have had to do so before the deadline. So now it's a lot harder for Newcastle to pull it off. The interest is genuine. We know they've spoken about Elanga. We know they've done more than that they've actually tried for him. But I think the reality is that Forest want to keep hold of Elanga. So it's going to be a difficult deal now for Newcastle to pull off.
Okay, and next question comes from Stephen Kennedy. He says, Ben, can you tell us where Trippier, Callum and Miggy are going to end up and how much should we expect for each of them? So we've already discussed Miggy. Saudi looks like it's a possibility at the moment. What about Trippier and Callum Wilson? Some news breaking today about Trippier's house being up for sale. And I think it's been probably the worst kept secret on Tyneside that he has had issues at home. So it does look as if Trippier will leave. And of course, that move almost came off in January when Bayern Munich came in. Callum Wilson, of course, not the greatest... not the greatest season again as far as fitness is concerned, but still banged the goals in when he was available. But again, looks as if he could be surplus to requirement. So what's your views on Trippier and Callum?
Yeah, I think we've covered Miggy, and with Callum, as I said earlier, Saudi interest, and definitely 2 PIF clubs were considering him right before the deadline, but it would just depend on whether the player wants to go. I spoke to someone close to the camp of Wilson, and I was led to believe that he would strongly consider it at this stage in his career, but nothing happened. From Newcastle's point of view, it's kind of win-win, because if he stays, they're not going to be gutted by that. They're not now trying to force him out the door. But if he goes, it might give them the opportunity to bring in one more and a slightly younger player to compete with Alexander Isak. And then let's not forget, you've got Anthony Gordon as well. And it'd be really interesting to see what Gordon's position is, because if he returns to Newcastle and says, I want to play more central at times, and that's part of me being happy and staying, then that's a decision that Eddie Howe will ultimately have to make. But I think in an ideal world, you got Gordon wide, you got Isak central, you got to pick one other. Maybe the right-sided player is a new signing. Maybe it's Miguel Almiron. The beauty of Joe Linton is that he can also play in that front line. You got Harvey Barnes as well. So depth is building. And then if you add a young, central, traditional type striker, then Newcastle will be in a very good position. So with Wilson, like I said before, you got West Ham You got Saudi, and maybe there'll be a domino effect for clubs at the moment like Everton and Crystal Palace that are looking at players like Nketiah and Broja. If they don't get one of those targets, they could even turn their attention to Callum Wilson as well. I don't think we're going to get another Chelsea type scenario. I know in January there were rumours that Chelsea might come in around the 18 million mark, but I still think that Chelsea will be looking for a younger striker. But it is interesting because if Wilson was a bit fitter, then I think you would have a big club like Chelsea thinking, why not? Because they've brought in Mark Guy, who's a young striker. They've brought in Amari Kellyman, who's a young striker. They've got Nicholas Jackson, who did well last season in the end statistically with 17 goals in all competitions, but is still ultimately very young. So as long as you're not going for Chelsea down the Aubameyang route that they tried and it failed because he wasn't the right character to be a squad player. But someone like Wilson might be prepared to go and if he's fit, play 30 of 60 games in terms of starting, set a goal tally of 10 to 15, and then be part of European football and the Club World Cup. So you never know. And that was why Chelsea considered it, not just because they thought he might be the right profile of experience in January, but also the right kind of character, not someone that's going to rock the boat if he's not playing every single week. So keep an eye on that because something could progress with Wilson where a bigger name club goes for him because they just think he's got that kind of experience. I heard Atletico Madrid were also giving him serious consideration, but it looks like Alvaro Morata is now going to stay. So I'm not sure that that one will progress. I'm not saying, by the way, for the Chelsea fans listening at the moment, that Chelsea are now considering. I'm specifically talking about January when they did give it a little bit of consideration, but decided not to proceed. And then with Kieran Trippier, I genuinely don't have that much new information to add. I know that Bayern are genuinely still keen. And that deal that fell through because Newcastle didn't want to sell in January was not really down to Thomas Tuchel driving it. It was very much the Bayern hierarchy. And therefore, they could be back for Trippier for sure. He's got absolutely no issue moving abroad again. He obviously joined Newcastle from Atletico Madrid. I feel like there would be Premier League clubs interested in him if he became available on the market. And I also think that he is not going to necessarily break the bank. It might be that Newcastle asks for about 20 million for him, given age and contractual situation and useful to get off the wage bill. But much like Wilson, if they can keep him, they'll want to keep him. The absolute untouchables are Isak, Guimaraes. The almost untouchables, if not 99.9% untouchables now, are Gordon and Botman. And then the sort of 50-50s that they'll consider under the right circumstances are probably Wilson and Trippier. And then the will sell or want to sell or actively pitching to try and get a deal for. We've seen it with Elliot Anderson. He's gone now. And I think that Miguel Almiron falls into that category, and so does Dubravka.
Okay, we've got 3,000 of you tuned in tonight for the Ben Jacobs transfer show. All we need you to do during the ads is open another window on your computer, open YouTube, search NUFC Matters, and hit the subscribe button. We'll be back after this. A big thanks to all our sponsors, Skips and Bins. You can find their website at skipsandbins.com. Contact us, www.skipsandbins.com/contact. Say hello to low-cost waste disposal with pay-as-you-go and contract waste management. A big thanks to Mr. Vicky's Sauces, handmade in Cumbria. Their website, mrvickies.co.uk. Email info@mrvickies.co.uk. Telephone 01768 210 102. Thanks to United Group Travel. They are the Travel and Tourism Award winners in 2024. Their website, www.unitedgrouptravel.com. Email beverly.ugtl@gmail.com or telephone 01670 632 460 or mobile 0791 666 4174. Just £30 per person deposit. There are no strangers on our tours, just friends you haven't met yet. A big thanks to Media Arts. You can find them at www.media-arts.co.uk. And don't forget, we are a podcast. You can find us on iTunes or Spotify or other podcast providers. If you want to help the channel grow, then hit the like button with the little thumb underneath the video. Click share and share to your social media, or join the channel for as little as $1.99 a month. If you want to take out a one-off
payment membership, go to nufcmatters.com and hit membership. And for a £25 fee, you get a scarf, a cup, a pen, and a membership card. You can also put a smartphone over the top of this QR code. It'll take you straight there. And don't forget, we also help the food bank on this channel. nufcfansfoodbank.co.uk is a website where you can make a virtual donation today.
And a couple of events coming up. The end of season 2 is nearly upon us, 18 days' time. In aid of Dementia Matters, 100 tickets sold already, only leaves you 40 tickets left. And it is Superman, Gibbo, George, and the Longsands raising money for Dementia Matters. Tickets are tenner, nufcmatters.com, newcastlelegends.com. Get yourself along. And Robley and Gibbo will be at the Gateshead Leisure Centre on the 2nd of August. Tickets selling well for that as well. It should be a great event. gatesheadleisurecentre.co.uk if you want tickets for that one. A little bit further ahead, Peter Beardsley will be at the Irish Centre next year, 10th of January. And newcastlelegends.com is the place for tickets for that. And the entertainers is announced as well. 15 players are going to be at that particular gig. And the VIP tickets, of course, you get a chance to meet the lads and schmooze with them. 24th of January, tickets available, Tyne Theatre and operahouse.uk or telephone 0844 249 1000. And last one, Martin Johnson, the 21st anniversary celebration dinner, 10 days' time, 3-course meal and coffee. Contact Danny Mitchell on 07817 412 524 if you want a night of rugby nostalgia. Okay, over 3,000 of you watching tonight. Please subscribe on YouTube, NUFC Matters. That's all you need to search and find. Let's get through the questions that you've sent us. Ali B, good evening. Any comment on the rumours that 2 sponsorship deals were held up by the Premier League, hence the scramble for sales?
No, not that I'm aware of. I think with these kind of sponsorship deals, it's really important to note that even though you see them announced during the new season, they're done quite far in advance. So it's not a case of putting something on the Premier League's desk for fair market value approval and then it being held up or delayed. It's very much a case of pre-planning a little bit further ahead. So Darren Eales in particular will be across a lot of that business, and I'm not aware of any roadblocks with the Premier League at this point. And obviously Newcastle have already declared various deals with Saudi links already that have direct connections or indirect ones to PIF, and they have been approved. And 1 or 2 of them have been long-standing partners now of Newcastle, such as Seller. So I'm not aware that Newcastle's finances have been severely or in fact at all impacted by the Premier League and any roadblocks with fair market valuation at this point. Going forwards, it might be a different story. We wait and see, but ultimately Newcastle are relatively content at the moment with their commercial business. They've done well to maximise the Saudi market so far. And of course, they're only going to strengthen those ties between now and the Vision 2030 and 4 years later, the World Cup in Saudi Arabia. It's obviously going to be a big region of business for Newcastle.
Okay, Benny says, question for Ben. Story this afternoon, that Barcelona have accepted an increased offer from Newcastle for Rafinha, but the player is not very tempted by the move. Is this accurate?
No, not that I'm aware. I mean, Rafinha, that part is correct. He wants to stay at Barcelona. I'm not aware of a formal offer from Newcastle for Rafinha. A target to some degree when there was that whole battle between Chelsea and Barcelona, and Newcastle were kind of there, as were Arsenal, just wondering whether or not there'd be an opportunity to move, but they ruled themselves out before those bids came in by Chelsea and Barcelona. So it ended up being a 2-way race. But I do think that Barcelona might have to sell somebody, and it looks like Ronald Araujo wants to stay, and so does Rafinha. But one of those two might need to be sacrificed, especially if they're to find a way of making Nico Williams work. So I wouldn't rule out Rafinha going somewhere if the player can be persuaded. And that's the thing that makes Barcelona so interesting, that if you look at Archie Gray in Leeds basically said to Archie Gray, whose whole family, his dad, his granddad, Eddie Gray as well, Leeds legend, whole Gray family synonymous with Leeds. And as I reported, when Brentford bid and then Spurs hijacked, Gray would have liked to stay at Leeds, but he had a conversation with the club, and the right thing to do to make sure the club complied with PSR was to go. So he maybe took that Premier League challenge a year early. And Kiernan Dewsbury Hall, the same. Boyhood club Leicester, not pushing to leave, but it helps Leicester. So it's a deal that suits all parties. So he's been announced now today. Whereas with Rafinha and Frankie de Jong and Ronald Araujo, they're not looking to do Barcelona any favours by leaving for the sake of leaving, as long as they're getting minutes. So that's the challenge, really. And Rafinha's wages are quite high as well. I suspect we're going to see an offer from Saudi for Rafinha. And my understanding remains, and it has been now for a couple of years, that Rafinha wants to go somewhere, if he stays in Europe, and play Champions League football, but maybe tempted by the riches on offer in Saudi Arabia, where he could maybe go and play Asian Champions League football. And the two clubs that I've heard for Rafinha, not Newcastle, they're both in Saudi, Al Hilal and Al Ahly. So watch this space, but the player does need big persuading if he's to leave Barcelona.
Okay, you heard it here first. Benny, another question. He says, given the value assigned to Anderson was 35 million, dare I say above market value or PSR, what was the transfer value for Vlachodimos? 10 million to give Forest a PSR profit of their own?
Yeah, I mean, both those figures are accurate to my understanding, although the specifics will never be shared. They're separate deals. Remember, when you therefore make the money, you can inject it onto your books for this current financial year that's just ended, and then you can amortize, in other words, divide the fee by the contract length for the one that you're paying for. And many of these amortized deals will outlast PSR if, as is expected, the financial rules change. So that gives you a little bit more leeway. And that's why these deals are separate rather than swap deals. The Premier League wrote to all of the clubs from their compliance office, and they said that the deals must be done at fair market value. But it's so difficult to determine what that valuation is. And obviously, if the market inflates and everyone therefore is using other deals as yardsticks, you can ultimately say it is fair market valuation. So I can understand how people say Elliot Anderson's not worth 35 million, but Archie Gray's just gone to Spurs for 40 million. And as much of a, in my view, generational talent as he may become, one of the best English players in his positions, he can play midfield or right back, he hasn't played Premier League football. He's 18 years of age. He's had one breakthrough season for Leeds, and he's 5 million more than Elliot Anderson. So you can definitely make those comparisons. Kiernan Dewsbury-Hall, fantastic season in the Championship. Elliot Anderson has been a Premier League player for a club ultimately that's been in the Champions League and finished in the top half of the table. So you can keep comparing like for like. And if everyone inflates the valuation to circumvent legally PSR, it's quite hard for the Premier League or any kind of independent body to clamp down on that, because there's plenty of evidence in this market that 35 million is fine for Elliot Anderson, just because the entire market is inflated. And collectively, if everyone's inflating it, then you give me another midfielder and you can bet your bottom dollar that they're there or thereabouts the same price as Elliot Anderson. So maybe it's 5 to 7 million too high. It's definitely benefited Newcastle United, but all of these deals are exactly the same. Ian Maatsen had a release clause at 35 million. He went for 37.5 million. It might be 40 million with add-ons. Amari Kellyman, a young striker at Aston Villa, was 19 million and has barely played a senior game. So everybody's doing it and it's legal. We should point that out. And they're simply using the same valuation formula. So this isn't about like-for-like deals. In other words, if Anderson's 35 million, it's not then a case of Newcastle having to find a deal for a player that they bring in for 35 million, so they cancel each other out. One player can be 10 million, one can be 35 million, but the point is they're using the same valuation formula, roughly, anyway. So if we were being cynical, we would say they're taking the market value and maybe both are agreeing to add 20% to that market valuation to come to a like-minded formula, so both clubs benefit as far as PSR is concerned. But of course, if you ask the clubs, they'll simply say they think the valuation is fair. They don't think it's inflated. And that's allowed them to do two separate deals, which satisfies both clubs as far as PSR is concerned. And they would still argue, I would imagine, the deals will also satisfy the Premier League because ultimately they are legal.
Okay, question for Ben from Gary. He says, then the sponsorship money from Adidas, Seller, and the Champions League money, does it get added to this year's account?
Yeah, they can add most of them to this year's accounts. Obviously, the sponsorship money are long-term deals, so you can add an annual amount to each of the books because a shirt sponsor might be a 3-year deal. and you can divide that equally, or you can actually be a little bit more creative, to my knowledge as well. But most tend to divide it equally, so you can classify it year on year on year. And that's also because some of the deals are structured where the amount will go up or even potentially down at certain clubs, depending on whether or not a club qualifies for European football. So you want it year on year on year if you possibly can. And then with any other costs, there's discretion to some extent. So buyer and seller can put deals on different years. Lewis Hall's a good example, whereby it was agreed with the obligation in this financial year that's just ended, but the deal was official and the contract started from the 1st of July. So both Chelsea and Newcastle would have the ability in that scenario to choose whether or not they wanted to put it on 2023-2024 or 2024-2025.
Okay. Ben, why do you think Newcastle don't have a training kit sponsor yet?
No idea is the short answer. I'm not Darren Eales or the sponsorship team, but I think that you're always trying to maximize the opportunity and not undersell yourself. And sometimes you wait and sometimes you go to market because you need to hold out for what ultimately is fair market valuation. And by fair market valuation, we always think of it in terms of a transfer being too high and questioned. But actually, sometimes clubs lowball because they're so desperate for the income or because they want to badge their training gear. And it can actually be beneficial for a club to stick to their guns and not just settle for the first sponsor that comes along because they feel that they're worth more. So I think Newcastle's sponsorship approach has always been patient to back the fact that the club, as both a football club and a model, as importantly, is growing and developing and expanding. And that means not just Newcastle United Football Club, but Newcastle United, the brand. So if you wait for that, then the right opportunity will come. And when it comes, you ultimately sell. Look at it in terms of naming of St James's Park. And I'm no way saying at this point that they're going to change the name of St James's Park. But let's say you wanted to because you needed the money. You could scramble and do it today. And of course, you'd have a taker that would like to change the name or have their name affiliated. And it's the same with Spurs. We've heard for about 5 years now that they're going to name the Tottenham Hotspur Stadium with a sponsor, and nothing's ever happened. And sometimes you just know that that bit of sponsorship asset is worth a massive amount of money. So you say, okay, we're either going to do nothing with it, or we're going to name our price and we're going to watch our football club and our brand develop until the point comes where we find a willing taker, and then we're going to pull the trigger on that deal. So I think Newcastle's sponsorship approach is very smart. It's very patient, and they know that the value of the asset is only going to go up. If you think about the takeover, even with the delays and even with all of the scrutiny, I think in the end, the final price was about 315 million. It was definitely between 300 and 350 million. We got lots of different sources and reports giving us lots of different numbers. Now, I think Newcastle's got to be worth $1 billion, right? Definitely 2 times worth that price, arguably 3 times worth that price. So if you think of it in those terms, as the value of the club goes up in total valuation, so does all these mini valuations of your training kit, your shirt sleeve, your front of shirt. So you wait and wait and wait. And then when the right opportunity comes, you cash in. And I just think that there's no imminent need for Newcastle, now they've satisfied PSR, to rush finding sponsors left, right and centre. So they're just going to wait. They're not short of suitors. And then when they finally do announce it, I think you'll find they're more lucrative than people are predicting at this stage.
Okay, 3,500 of you watching. Thanks very much. We never take that kind of support for granted. Great to have you with us. And if you don't mind, open your window on your computer, go to YouTube and hit the subscribe button. We do 7 shows a week. Okay, let's find a few more questions. Phil Shuttleworth, simple question for Ben. Did we offer Gordon to Liverpool or not?
Yeah, that's my understanding. I know there's a bit of contention here. Some say Liverpool made the approach. Some say Newcastle made the approach. My understanding is that Newcastle alerted Liverpool to a possible opportunity, and it wasn't something that Liverpool wanted to do, largely because whoever it alerted, the price or the package was always going to be roughly the same. So this isn't a massive cut price deal where, as maybe people wrongly assume, Newcastle call up Liverpool and say Gordon's available for 40 million less than he would be in a week's time, or if we satisfy PSR, take him or leave him. I think if that was how it was genuinely framed, then Liverpool might have moved. It was much more a informal alert that if Liverpool were considering making something, Newcastle would hear the proposal. And that just shows you that they were scrambling, to be perfectly honest. So they were spinning multiple plates of multiple outgoings with a view to one or two getting done to find that number in excess of 50 million. And you have to do this because if you're Newcastle, you almost have to put everyone that could go in a position where they might go and then work out who's prepared to actually do the deal, then do the maths. And then you have your pecking order and you say, well, if we can do the maths for Anderson and Minter, then sorry, Gordon's no longer for sale. But it would have been foolish for Newcastle to only look at Anderson and Minter, because imagine if one had failed a medical or decided they didn't want to go, or the club had a plan A and one of those players was a plan B, then you've got no time left. And then before you know it, you might get a PSR breach. So it comes back to what I said before. And I know we've had many, many weeks of people saying Newcastle are fine, Newcastle don't need to bring in money. But I think hindsight tells us now that they did need a relatively large number to satisfy themselves for PSR. So this is why Gordon had to be one of the names discussed and offered, because you never know. Minter or Anderson could have not come off and it might have been their only way out. And that doesn't mean Newcastle wanted to sell, and it doesn't mean that they will sell now because they're in a healthier position, but it shows you that they were very busy and they were spinning multiple potential outgoings to make sure that they comply with PSR.
Okay, next question. Let's look for somebody different. Daniel, what's Gabby Vega looking like in the Saudi League this season? Is there any talk of a transfer?
No, I think he's quite happy, actually. We've heard a lot of rumours, particularly in Italy with Napoli and Roma looking, but I expect the player to stay another year. Remember, he's young. He can always come back to Europe. And the other really key point in all of this is you've got to stay in Saudi Arabia for 2 years. Otherwise, you won't get tax-free. So most of the players like Vega that have only been there a year will stay for another year. And then it becomes really lucrative. If they do what Jordan Henderson did and they leave after only a year, then they actually have to pay the taxes and various other penalties. And they don't get some of the bonuses and the signing on fees. And they have to pay their accommodation back for many of the clubs. So in the end, you can lose money or you can barely make any money. And this is why I think that Vega's relatively settled still at Al Ahly and will do another 12 months.
Okay, interesting question from Mick. He said, Ben, can you explain amortization transfers? Some people seem to think if we receive 50 million, we can spend 200 million.
No, I mean, amortization is simply the practice of dividing the transfer fee by the contract length. So if you've got a 10 million fee and you hand out a 5-year contract, then you can divide on your books that 10 million by 5. And it's pro-rated daily. So let's say you make the transfer on the financial deadline, you'll pay 1 day pro rata in this financial year that's just ended. And then everything else will be divided by the contract length going forwards. So if you sign a player now, then you can divide that by up to 5 years, but no longer anymore. That was a loophole after Chelsea started handing out long-term contracts that was shut by UEFA. So 5 years is the maximum. You can still offer a 6, 7, 8 year contract, but you can only divide it by 5. And that is amortization in a nutshell. So it's a way of shouldering the burden. And it can be very positive, but it does also mean that a bit like credit card debt, some of the historical costs linger. Because if you're Chelsea and you sign Mudryk or Enzo Fernandez, it sounds great, doesn't it? They're 100 million odd signings and you divide them by several years. But when you get 4, 5, 6 years in, you're still paying them off, much like you would be a credit card debt. And because that's so long, in those 6, 7 years, you've got other amortized costs. So eventually you could start a financial year with lots of little costs, but they could all end up adding to 50, 60, 70 million. And that's where you still will constantly need sales. And Chelsea are good at that because they've got a model where their academy has always been relatively profitable. Whereas I think with Newcastle United, they will appreciate the amortization because the amortization will outlast the current PSR rules. And then when the squad cost control measures come in, where clubs can spend up to 85% of their total revenue on player wages, agent fees and transfer fees, they'll have a little bit more rope to work with. And of course, in 2, 3, 4 years' time, the Newcastle model may be multi-club, may have developed further, maybe on a more financial footing, and then we'll see the true flex of PSR being out and PIF coming in, and they'll be able to really use some of their financial power. Because it's a strange situation, isn't it, where it's PIF against PSR at the moment, and PIF are these financial heavyweights, but PSR rules stop them from really spending their money. But if PSR phases out and slightly more flexible financial rules come in, then you would expect PIF to then be able to really show their full financial weight. And that's when Newcastle will be able to keep pace with the so-called Big Six.
Okay, lots of questions coming in. A couple of quick fire ones. Ben, is there anything on Rafael Leao? Newcastle have been linked with him?
No, not that I'm aware of. I think Leao will stay at Milan, to be perfectly honest with you. If he was to move, I would predict PSG to be a suitor to watch. They're still assessing their striker targets at the moment, but you're talking about well in excess of 100 million euros to get Leao. I think the release clause at the moment is 125 million euros or thereabouts. Apologies if I've not got that spot on, but to my knowledge, it's something within that ballpark. So I don't think that Newcastle will move for Leao. I know that 6 or 7 months ago, there was some internal discussions when Dan Ashworth was still at the club, but that's not my understanding. And it'd also be quite difficult, I think, for Newcastle to frame to Leao the right pitch when Isak is the main lead striker. I'm not saying that Leao and Isak can't play together because Leao's quite versatile, but in that 4-3-3, I'm not that sure that the football pitch would be something that Leao would be sold on. And in addition to that, you've got to be able to pay wages that would break Newcastle's wage structure. So for me, that one is a non-starter.
Okay, Morgan Gibbs-White's another name that Tom Dixon's chucked into the frame.
Yeah, I think Morgan Gibbs-White is a name that Newcastle really like. I'm not aware that at this stage they've engaged in any negotiations, but a relatively long-standing target. We are probably looking more at a player like Noni Madueke as somebody that if Newcastle thought they could get, they would probably move in that direction. And let's not forget Jared Bowen as well, someone that we've not spoken about. Those are two concrete targets for Newcastle, to my knowledge.
Okay, we did speak about Almiron earlier on, live goals. If you want to watch the start of the programme, you'll find out a little bit about that.
Yeah, just on that, Steve, it won't be that high. It won't be 31 million, to my knowledge. That's 40 million euros. The verbal agreement, even though Newcastle may now deny it, but to my knowledge, and I can only give you my information, so I respect anyone that says otherwise, but my knowledge is that the Al Shabab Newcastle verbal agreement in January was about 30 million euros. And if someone matches that, so that's about 25 million quid, then my understanding is that Newcastle will sell.
Okay, Anthony says, Ben, will we be spending in Italy again this summer for a centre-back, Calafiore, Theo or Tomori?
Yeah, Theo's the one that I think Newcastle really likes, so keep an eye on that one. Not an easy deal to do with Milan. I've not heard anything with Tomori, and with Calafiore, it'll be a big surprise if he doesn't leave Bologna, but I would keep a closer eye on Arsenal or Chelsea. I think he wants to move to London. I think he'll have more than one Premier League suitor. And there's like a trend at the moment of Liverpool, of Chelsea, of Arsenal, all looking for this left-sided defender, whether it's left-sided centre-back or full-back. So Arsenal wanted Jorel Hato, but the expectation is that he stays at Ajax, and he's a centre-back that can play left-back. You've got Chelsea who want to bring in another left-sided defender who also might be able to go over onto that left-hand side. And then Liverpool have been linked with Calafiore, and they have seriously considered him. But my understanding is they're not actively working on that deal anymore. So I think Newcastle would have their work cut out to get Calafiore, because I think the player's had his head turned by the possibility of playing some form of European football and also going to London if you can find a deal there. And obviously you have Chelsea and Arsenal that can both give him that. I would just keep one eye on West Ham United as well, because as we said earlier, they are bidding for Max Kilman, and the expectation is that they'll beat Newcastle to his signature if he's to leave Wolves. No guarantee, but Wolves want 45 million. And if they get that number, they'll probably sanction an exit. And it's not that Kilman isn't interested in the Newcastle project. It's just the fact that you got Julian Lopetegui, who he really enjoyed playing under at Wolves, and he's now the West Ham manager. So that definitely gives West Ham a bit of an advantage. And if they don't get Kilman, don't be surprised if they try an audacious move for Calafiore as well.
Okay, any news on the replacement of Ashworth?
Yes, although for reasons I can't explain on air, I can't go into too much detail on this one. And when something is official, I will explain exactly why. But Newcastle are still proceeding in their search to replace Ashworth, and they've narrowed down what I'm told are 2 final candidates. We know, of course, that they wanted Dougie Freeman, but Crystal Palace wanted to keep him. Johannes Spoors is the other name that we can mention, and it will still be no surprise if they go for the group head of 777. But I think the delay is down to the fact that at this stage in the window, as much as Newcastle would like somebody to start immediately, I think if they were to have to get through the summer without somebody starting, they would feel okay because clubs plan ahead. So Ashworth has influenced this window, even though he's now left the football club. And everyone else at the football club is relatively content that they can proceed with the targets and get the targets. So any new sporting director would only really be enacting the plan of Dan Ashworth. And that's why I think whether someone comes today, tomorrow, next month or September the 1st, it won't really bother Newcastle as much because they feel relatively in control of the situation. And now we just wait and see whether or not they can get someone over the line. The delay, to my knowledge, though, is down to the fact it's not just about hiring a sporting director. It's about PIF specifically working out what they need, because Newcastle are concurrently going to be in the conversation with a range of other clubs that may or may not be directly multi-club. And that's what's really interesting about everything that's going on at the moment. Does a Saudi entity buy Monaco, for example, which is put up for sale by Rain Group, 67% of the club, with the royal family keeping the rest? And is that going to be directly part of Newcastle, or is that going to just be another Saudi ownership? And until they clarify that situation, the person coming in at Newcastle won't know whether they're going to be a Michael Edwards CEO of football with a sporting director beneath them, or whether they're just going to be sporting director of Newcastle. And if they're just sporting director of Newcastle, in 3 months or 6 months, is there going to be a group head above them? And the confusion is down to the fact, and I appreciate Newcastle fans will hear any other Saudi entity and say, why Newcastle this, why Newcastle that? But I can tell you it's a very positive thing, because one day, sooner rather than later, Newcastle will be part of multi-club, and they'll sit right at the top of multi-club, regardless of whether it's Monaco or Marseille or whoever. No one's going to be bigger than Newcastle as an individual asset within multi-club, because they're a Premier League club that the owners want to play Champions League football and win trophies. And you can't get much bigger than an English club in the Champions League winning trophies. So there's no fear that they buy someone else and lose interest in Newcastle. But the confusion is down to the fact that PIF and the ministry have a specific acquisitions department, which I suppose is a little bit like QSI, Qatar Sports Investments. And anything anybody does will either be done by that department or alternatively endorsed by that department, whether it's another entity, whether it's public, whether it's private, whether it's an individual. So you don't do anything in Saudi Arabia with that entity not knowing about it. And therefore, if someone is buying independent of Newcastle in Saudi a club, then PIF will know about it, and they'll either be formally involved or informally involved, in the same way that QSI had an informal involvement with Sheikh Jassim and Manchester United, and a formal involvement in buying Braga, which now sits under the QSI model in minority investment along with PSG. So once you understand that, you have to understand how complicated it is, because even if you're just some singular Saudi that wants to go and buy Marseille with nothing to do with Newcastle, you've still got to go through the process and get the endorsements and keep everybody in the loop. And then effectively PIF and the ministry will decide, do we want that individual to do that, or do we want to connect it to Newcastle? So there's always going to be a de facto PIF involvement. And then as they structure it, maybe they structure it completely separate to Newcastle, maybe they don't. And I'll give you an example that I heard from a year ago. So at this stage, I'm not saying that anything is active, but PIF held a conversation with 777, and they said, we know you're struggling. What's the best way of holding a conversation to see whether all of your clubs or one of your club is available? And do we want to give you money? Do we want to have minority? Do we want to buy one of your clubs? Do we want to buy all of your clubs? Or do we want to connect you with Newcastle or have a separation between Newcastle? And this is just Saudi doing what Saudi is supposed to do. Because remember, during the pandemic, so this is not something that's active now, the remit of PIF was to go out there and make opportunistic deals and to take advantage of the fact that people needed taking over in every sector under the sun outside of oil and gas. So go and make opportunistic purchases, and then you get value. And then obviously you get a return on investment. So it's never for Newcastle directly or definitely separate from Newcastle at this early stage when they think of who to acquire. It's just done centrally, and then it will either be allocated to an individual, an entity, a third party of PIF, or maybe PIF themselves. And then they'll work out whether they want a formal connection with Newcastle, an informal connection with Newcastle, or no connection with Newcastle. And we have to wait and see as things progress. But if you're active on these things, and I can tell you categorically the Saudis are active on Monaco at the moment, you have to work out what you're going to do. And it might delay the appointment of either a sporting director or CEO of football until they know if that deal is going to come off, and until they know what their structure is going to be, and if they know if Newcastle is or isn't a relevant player within that kind of acquisition. And this is why, in short, it's complicated. So we wait and see how quickly Newcastle can move. But I don't think they mind if the sporting director is appointed today, tomorrow, next week, or after the window, because they feel confident in the transition, even though it was a bit acrimonious in the end, his departure that Dan Ashworth left them with.
Yeah, great stuff, Ben, as always. Hopefully get you back on next Tuesday if you're free. Stick it in your diary because it is a busy time at Newcastle, both ins and outs. But for now, Ben Jacobs, thanks very much, mate. Take care.
Wait a second, Steve. Hang on.
He's back.
Bonus time. Very quick bonus time, because I think as my messages are blowing up, I have to actually go on TalkSport in a second. But do we not have the small matter before I go of a bet to discuss?
Oh, go on then. What do you want to say next?
I don't know, because I wasn't listening. And I know that's a really bad thing to say, but I was told something about a show and a bet from my Leicester Newcastle thing. And I was told that it was going to be put to me, but I don't actually know what was said on the previous show.
Stu Penman hasn't sent me the text message, which he said he would. So let's keep it till next week.
It's something to do with Leicester and Newcastle finishing above each other, which I said I would take.
I told him to send us it by text, mate, because honestly, it was so confusing. It was in the middle of a show. I don't have time to watch anyone else's shows, never mind watch back my own shows. So if he sends me it, that'll be a no mark by us. It wasn't a boxing match. But listen, Stu was supposed to message me, Gary.
Yeah, I'm not taking a bet on a boxing match because there's only going to be one winner, and it's not going to be Ben Jacobs in a boxing match. I don't even think I would win a boxing match against a mouse, let alone Stu.
Ben, as always, pleasure to have you on. Hopefully, Stu will text me that and we'll get that sorted next Tuesday. Take care, mate.
All the best, everyone. Have a good week.